to discuss our topic. Ms. Christina Chanes is a cooperative extension agent within UVI's corporate cooperative extension service and is responsible for a variety of youth and community-focused grants that emphasize the importance of water conservation and water quality. For the past 7 years, she has been focused as a researcher who specializes in community outreach and presents both nationally and internationally at conferences about water quality and conservation. Recently, she helped collect and organize assorted rainfall data sets that have been led to the establishment of a drought monitoring system for the territory. Dr. Greg Wanell is the director of the Caribbean Green Technology Center at the University of the Virgin Islands. Dr. Guanel is a trained coastal and ocean engineer and civil engineer. At UVI, Dr. Guanel is also co-leading the update of the hazard mitigation plan for the territory of the Virgin Islands. Prior to his time here at UVI, Dr. Guanel was the Nature Conservancy's TNC first director of urban program for the state of Florida, where he worked with various stakeholders to implement climate adaptation strategies that promote risk reduction through the construction of green infrastructure and community resilience. And lastly, but not least, Dr. Kim Waddell is the director of the Virgin Islands established program to stimulate competitive resource, also known as VI EPSCoR, at the University of the Virgin Islands. VI EPSCoR is a large territory-wide research capacity building program supported by the National Science Foundation. Kim is also the project lead for the update of the territory's hazard mitigation plan. Dr. Waddell is a trained ecologist with expertise in ecosystem function and processes, and prior to working here at UVI, he was a senior program officer and study director at the National Academies of Science in Washington, D.C., where he prepared reports on agriculture, marine sciences, and environmental risk management topics. To make sure the upcoming session is as productive as it can be, let me share some housekeeping rules before we get started. Our panelists cannot hear you. You can minimize your panelist view by clicking on the button as indicated on the screen. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A box in your Zoom control panel. We'll bring them up during the presentation, and we will also have time for questions at the end. You can place comments to each other in the chat area, accessible by clicking that icon. Please be respectful of others. We are prepared to extend the webinar to accommodate questions, so please don't feel as though there won't be enough time for interaction with the panelists. Many in our audience are experts. Welcome. We value your opinions and anticipate having brief interactive comments at the end of the presentations. Please identify yourself before speaking, even if you believe your voice is easy to identify, and turn your mobile phone and other devices to silent. A recorded version of this webinar will be available by Friday on YouTube and the Hazard Mitigation and Resilience Plans Facebook page. We've provided at the end, the last slide, Dr. Waddell's email contact information should you think of the perfect question after the webinar has ended. Please feel free to email your questions. So, what is climate change? And how is it different from weather? Weather is the changes that we see and feel outside from day to day. It might rain one day and be sunny the next. Sometimes it's cold, sometimes it's hot. The term climate refers to the general weather conditions of a place over many years. Climate change is a significant variation of average weather conditions over several decades or more. It's that longer term that differentiates climate change from natural weather variability. Climate change refers to the rise in the average surface temperatures on Earth. What causes climate change? An overwhelming scientific consensus maintains that climate change is due primarily to the human use of fossil fuels, which releases carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the air. The gases trap heat within the atmosphere, which can have a range of effects on ecosystems, including rising sea levels, severe weather events, and droughts that render landscapes more susceptible to wildfires. Greenhouse gases play an important role in keeping the planet warm enough to inhabit, but the amount of these gases in our atmosphere has skyrocketed in recent decades. As climate change transforms global ecosystems, it affects everything from the places we live, to the water we drink, to the air we breathe. Now, we have put together several polls that we'll be conducting during the course of the webinar. There are no wrong answers, so please participate. And the poll questions are up on the screen. I believe you'll be able to click with a button to share your answers. The first question is, how important is the climate change threat to the Virgin Islands? Okay, thank you. To tell you a little bit more about why our hazard mitigation and resilience plan addresses climate change, please welcome Dr. Kim Waddell.
Yes, good evening. As Ms. Richards noted, I'm going to give a brief overview about the background of the Hazard Mitigation and Resilience Plan. But before I get started, I want to, given our audience, which is quite broad in understanding and expertise around this topic, please be aware that we are still in the information sharing and gathering stage. So please do not expect any sort of adaptation strategies to be articulated during this webinar, just for those of you that are deeply involved in hazard mitigation or adaptation. So all states and territories, if they want to be eligible for non-disaster related FEMA funding, must have a current hazard mitigation plan in place. Now, these plans are updated every 5 years. And here in the Virgin Islands, VITEMA prepared and successfully submitted their plan for the territory back in July 2019. So the plan that UVI is partnering with VITEMA is underway, and the activities like this webinar are designed to create public awareness and support for the recovery and risk reduction initiatives. Now, you should probably notice that we have added the term resilience into the planning terminology here, and I'll speak more to that on the next slide. However, integrating resilience into the planning process allows us to integrate slow, persistent threats like climate change into the mitigation planning process, highlighting the need for a longer temporal perspective as we think about the ongoing development and strategies for the territory. Next slide. So one of the things we wanted to do in developing the plan is recognize key principles that would guide our thinking when we articulate the strategies and recommendations that emerge with the completed plan. And so here you can see resilience, sustainability, climate adaptation, social cultural awareness, and capacity building. All of us have heard these terms many times before, and we probably could spend hours refining and defining, particularly the first two, resilience and sustainability. But think of the first two as not as static endpoints or fixed goals. Think of them as a suite of dynamic actions that really don't stop moving. I mean, if you think about the built environment, as you fix or repair or replace one building, another building or infrastructure is degrading or ready to collapse or what have you. And so we're constantly in motion dealing with these two issues. We included climate adaptation as a principle, and apparently we may be one of the first jurisdictions preparing a hazard mitigation plan to do so with our HMP, the hazard mitigation planning effort. And for island communities, this is absolutely essential and prudent given how climate change can influence the hazards that we face and want to mitigate. So I think I'll turn it back over to Greg, and he'll take it.
Yeah, thank you. And before that, if we can see the result of the previous poll, Michael. So climate change is very important. So that's really good. That's good to hear. So I'm very glad that most of you are here to learn more. But we are talking to an informed and very well informed audience. So that's really good. So before we go into the details, we're going to have a second poll, and we're going to show the result of this poll before I go on with the presentation. But just before we start, which of these impacts have you witnessed so far in your life here in the VI? So I'm going to give you guys maybe 10 seconds to answer, and I believe you can choose many answers. 5 more seconds. Okay, let's see what type of result do we get.
1 second, people are still answering.
Oh, people are still answering, okay. All right, 5 more seconds, guys. Yeah, longer drought, change in rainfall patterns, higher temperature. Those are the things that we've noticed. Change in vegetation, animal behavior. Those are very interesting, less talked about, but very important. Thank you. So let's talk about climate change. So Ms. Richards provided you with an overall background of what causes climate change and why it's so important. And Kim talked to you about why we have to take it into account into the HMP here in the Virgin Islands. And for us, when we think about climate change, I think the wake-up call for the Virgin Islands was the 2017 hurricane, where we had, category 5 hurricanes in the Virgin Islands and 2 in less than 2 weeks. The bad news is that climate change will make these threats of hurricane even more important for us. The science pretty much tells us that when we're going to have hurricane or tropical storms, the rainfall rates will probably increase. We're already noticing that, and if you are following the news this year with Hurricane Laura and others who are hitting the US and other places, they talk a lot about rainfall, big rainfall. What also we have noticed with Irma and Maria, and we saw it with Dorian, is that the hurricanes are intensifying pretty rapidly. And this will continue. This sort of, in less than a day, you go from a tropical storm to a Cat 2, or from a Cat 1 to a Cat 2 in just a few hours. Things we didn't see in the past is now coming very, very common. The hurricanes will also become more intense. They are already more intense, going back to Irma and Maria, but not more necessarily frequent. But when they will hit hard. And then the fact is that the same way that the rainfall rate will increase, storm surge will increase, mostly because the sea level is rising. So there is a series of compounding phenomena that are making the threat of hurricane even more dangerous here for us in the Virgin Islands. But when we talk about climate change, we're talking about a whole lot of things. And you members of the audience already noticed it in your earlier answers. So first, temperatures are rising. So temperatures have risen by approximately 4 Fahrenheit in the past 100 years, and they will continue to rise. We can expect between 1 and an extra 1 to 2 degrees, 2.6 degrees in increase in temperature by, in the next 20 to 30 years. What we are also noticing is that the average wind speed is decreasing. So the cooling factor, the breeze that we have here that sort of prevents, us from being too hot, well, the wind speed is decreasing. So this sort of felt temperature, the degree to which we say, oh, it's hot, it's really hot, this will increase. It's going to be more and more uncomfortable for us because we will lose that cooling factor. And then what we also need to expect is that, and we're seeing this already, is that the number of hot days, and especially warm nights where we need the cooler temperature for our body to relax and calm down and have a comfortable night, the number of hot days and hot nights and warm nights will increase. So it's going to be a little bit uncomfortable here in the Virgin Islands moving forward. But this change of temperature has some more global consequence. The first is a changing in rainfall patterns. Rainfall patterns have always been very varied in the VI. One day it's very wet, one day it's very dry. But in the last few decades, what we found is that the Virgin Island is drying. And this year was particularly interesting because May was the driest month on record for St. Thomas and the 9th driest for St. Croix. And what we always also found as part of our study for the HMP is that 9 out of 10 of the worst long-term drought occurred only in the last 30 years. We have records of weather pattern and rainfall in the Virgin Islands for more than 50, 70 years. And what we found is that it's just getting drier in the last 30 years. All those records just keep being broken one year after the other. And moving forward, what we will see is that it's just going to get drier. We expect a reduction of between 3 and 12%, of rainfall by the 2050s and up to a quarter by 2100. The somewhat good news is that the sort of rainfall conditions, we don't really see a change in terms of, when it rains, is it harder or not? We don't really see anything so far. But the bad news is that when we have storms and hurricanes, those events will become wetter. We will see much bigger, higher amount of rainfall falling during big storm events than in the past. And that will have consequences in our ability to prevent flooding from happening. Another thing that we've noticed is that the sea level is rising. Sea level has risen by more than 3 inches since the 70s, and it's just going to continue to rise. And if you follow the news where they are, following what's happening in the North and South Pole, the news is not good. The sea level can be expected to rise by an additional, half a foot to a foot by 2050. But if we follow the sort of what's happening in the pole, we should really sort of plan for the worst here in terms of sea level rise in the Virgin Islands. What we thought would be an average increase, it's likely going to be a more extreme. So we should probably plan for a 1 foot to 1.5 foot increase of sea level rise by 2050. And the consequences are going to be very, very damaging for us in the Virgin Islands because we are an island, we have coasts, and we have a finite amount of land, and we love our beaches and our coastal resources. But the fact is, as sea level rises, those coastal infrastructure, beaches, all those coastal resources are getting flooded and they are eroding away. The waves are reaching further inland than before, especially in guts along the coast. And so what that means is that in addition for, our coast getting wetter and flooded on a more regular basis, drainage, getting rid of water is getting more difficult because the guts are already full when they receive all that rainwater coming from the, from the mountain and the bush. So those are just some maps of what to expect with a 2 feet increase in sea level rise, which is a scenario that is not, too out of the ordinary for us to expect by 2050. And we see the good news is that we do not lose a vast amount of land. We have a relief, a topography that is such that we don't have a lot of very, very low-lying area like, some part of the United States or the islands. But what you see is that pretty much all our coastline is just surrounded with this thin little blue line, which means that access to our coastal resources is just going to be more difficult. All the coastal roads going here on St. Croix to the Sandy Point, all of that will probably going to be more exposed to the impact of sea level rise. Salt River and other sort of coastal region also be impacted by sea level rise. On St. John, you see a lot of the beaches are now surrounded by the thin blue line. So you can expect a lot of coastal erosion, all those coastal roads, all those coastal infrastructure for us, the changing rooms and the bathing station, all of that will be now more exposed to erosion because what that means, the waves can now reach further inland than before and erode what was in the past dry land. On St. Thomas, we can see that Megan's Bay again, getting flooded, Smith Bay, Bovoni, even town, the water is a little bit higher than before. So again, beach eroding, drainage more difficult. We will not have to evacuate, But when you have major storms, storm surge, when you have big swells, those will have more impact than they had before. So I will let my friend Christina now talk about another type of impact of climate change that we also need to worry about, which are the health impacts.
Good evening. I'd like to draw your attention to the CDC slide shown here, which describes some of the health impacts due to climate change. Climate change can impact health in a variety of ways. Air pollution and Sahara dust can affect us by way of asthma, allergies, and cardiovascular disease. Changes in vector ecology, including dengue, chikungunya, and Zika, are very real. In 2017, the Department of Health gave out more than 1,300 Zika prevention kits to pregnant women, and also in response to the Zika outbreak, did more than nearly 400 outreach events. In 2020, dengue is reported to be one of the highest risks of the season. Water quality impacts can include an upset stomach, fever, diarrhea, vomiting, all of which can be caused and occur post-hurricane and or in instances of flooding. Health impacts related to climate change can also include food shortages and can also impact our water supply via rooftop collection. Drought can impact us because obviously for those of us that collect water from our roofs, it costs money to refill an empty cistern. And that also impacts our drinking water, our cooking, and our overall livelihood. Agriculture is also a very real and important area of impact as it relates to food security. Food access in the territory is very important. We rely not only on micro and home gardens, but also it impacts our farmers, specialty and row crop production, as well as poultry and livestock. Lastly, I would like to point out that the Wall Street Journal reported just today that extreme weather, including hurricanes, can have a health impact as it relates to the spread of COVID-19.
Thank you, Christina. So based on, this was a very brief overview of how climate will impact us in the territory. And in the last few minutes of this presentation, we will talk about how we are taking all this information into account into the HMP and how we're thinking about integrated some of what we are finding about climate impact into crafting the mitigation strategies for the territory. But before we do that, we have another poll for you guys. So this poll question is of basically based on what you've heard, what is the type of impact that you are most concerned about? So we're gonna take 15 seconds to answer those. Five more seconds. Okay, Michael, are we ready?
5 more seconds, 5 more seconds.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, interesting. Quality of life and health, definitely. And our coastal resources. Yeah, I agree with all those answers. There is no right or wrong answers, but I like what you guys are saying. So what are we gonna do about it? So there are some implications for communities. We are still working with those, but what's following up on what Christina just said and what Kim and Ms. Richards and I have talked about so far, as we are moving towards sort of thinking about recommendation strategies for the hazard mitigation and resilience plan for the territory, we're gonna start paying attention to water and energy security. Water is gonna be a big problem for us in the VI. Yes, we have desalination plant, but most of us rely on water collected from our roof, and it costs a lot of money to fill those cisterns. We also need to think about what's happening in terms of our ability to have access to the service, to the things that we like and that we depend on for our survival, such as energy, water, food, and basically ensuring that our house and the way that we build our house is built in a way that is robust, and we have different options to access telecommunication, to access energy, to access water, etc., etc. We also are very cognizant of the fact that, even if we have a solid house that can resist the impact of a hurricane or a disaster, even if we have water and food and energy and telecommunication in our house, it's important for us to be in a good mental state for us to recover properly from the impact of the hazard. So we are also paying attention to physical and mental health, and what does that mean for us in the territory to have access to those services post-disaster. And then lastly, what we love about the Virgin Islands is our culture, it's our friends, families, and the natural resources that we enjoy on a regular basis. So preservation of cultural and natural resources for us to maintain our sense of identity, our sense of community is also going to be very important for us. And that's something that we're going to be looking at as we move forward with the finalization of the HMP. From a more sort of pragmatic side and traditional side, I would say the implications for infrastructure are also very varied and complex. First, we're going to be pushing for integration of climate change impact in the design of any type of civil infrastructure. From the good news is that for us who live on St. Thomas, those who designed the expansion of Veterans Drive did take into account sea level rise into their design. They did not take into account potential increase of rainfall during hurricane, and they didn't take into account whether or not the drainage infrastructure will be submerged because of sea level rise. So we're going to be pushing for a more comprehensive sort of integration of climate impact into the design of civil infrastructure, from roads to wastewater to energy to anything that we depend on for us to live a quality life in the Virgin Islands. We're also going to be pushing for the adoption of adaptive design approaches in a way that, yes, we can build something now, but let's think about the future and ways that we're going to have to design that thing in the future and put some of those concepts now so that it doesn't cost too much when you need to upgrade when we find out that sea level is higher than before, or it's raining differently than before, for example. We're going to also have some conversation about the need to adjust some of the coastal and land development laws and regulations so we can build differently and we are not so much at the risk of impact of hazards. We also, as I mentioned earlier, looking at the health and what needs to happen for the health infrastructure so that we have good physical and mental health. And then the thing about climate change is that it's going to be full of surprises. There will be things that will happen in the future that we never experienced in the past, such as Irma and Maria. Those type of surprises will probably going to become more common. So we need to start thinking from a government and non-government point of view, what type of capacity and capabilities we need to build so that we are better prepared to deal with those surprises. The good news is that we are also making some good progress, and one in particular is drought. So Christina, would you mind talking about all what's going on the drought mitigation side?
Sure. So the University of the Virgin Islands has been working on environmental issues for a number of years with an emphasis in drought and drought mitigation. As Greg mentioned earlier, we did access and help to digitize and archive with USDA's assistance 150 years worth of precipitation data. And last year, my students were able to digitize and submit to USDA about 74 years of historical data that was from the fort, actually. It was the harbor master's weather book, and we were able to utilize that, which gives them a historic data set for them to look at. Currently, the problems that we're having and what we're trying to do is help the farmers in the territory. In 2015, we found that we could only get a drought declaration for the farmers, which are particularly livestock farmers, if we had secure, current, and consistent data collection. We weren't able to do that. The only way that we were able to get that drought declaration with the assistance of the delegate and VI Department of Agriculture, along with the Farm Service Agency, was to use rain gauges that were available to us from the National Weather Service. At the same time that that was going on, we decided that we needed to come together as a community and work collaboratively with other federal partners in order to come up with a plan to get accurate data collection in real time. In doing so, we partnered with NOAA, USDA Tropical Forestry, the Climate Hub. I'm probably forgetting several other agencies, but we all came together and decided that we needed a consistent territory-wide plan that would help us to do that we would be able to submit directly to the drought monitors, which are national climatologists and meteorologists who study and model this information. Fast forward to 2020, and we were able to get a drought declaration because we built a network with human capital. We have volunteers across the territory that are manually taking rain gauge data, submitting it to the drought monitors, and they are able to model this information in real time. The output of that is in 2020, we got a drought declaration for the island of St. Croix and the island of St. John for 4 months, and St. Thomas for 1 month. What's interesting to note is that St. John and St. Thomas, this was the first time that it happened. And the key thing that I want you to take away from this is it wasn't the researchers, it wasn't the university, it wasn't the federal partners, it was the community. So our community plays a vital role in drought and drought mitigation. Our next steps are to develop a drought meeting in January of 2021, where we will work with the farming community, our community stakeholders, our drought reporters, and of course, our hazard mitigation team under the direction of Dr. Waddell and Dr. Gunnell.
Thank you, Christina. And as Christina said, a lot has been done to help us start mitigate the impact of drought, and more work needs to be done here in the territory to maybe think about how we're going to have to change our crop and water management and how we're going to address water security for household as well as farmers. So more work to be done, but we are making good progress in really tackling this very severe threat, climate associated threat here in the territory. So we're pretty much done. Kim, I will now let the project lead, Dr. Waddell, Kim, finalize some sentences and some slides.
Well, thank you, Greg, and thank you, Christina. I think collectively we've presented some key reasons for integrating climate change into the Hazard Mitigation and Resilience Plan. So the question is, what can we expect here in the Virgin Islands? And you can see from this slide, and the points have been made numerous times. We're going to be hotter, it's going to be drier. Sea level rise will continue to threaten coastal areas, places like our iconic beaches on the north shore of St. John, or Megan's Bay here at St. Thomas, or Sandy Point in St. Croix. These are all at risk without some sort of management action or mitigation action taken by the community and by the public sector. But even our developed areas along the coast, whether it's the waterfronts, you saw the picture from the new waterfront here in Charlotte Amalia and St. Thomas, but Cruz Bay, Christiansted, Frederiksted, all of them have streets and roads right up next to the water, and these areas are going to be seeing increased flooding. I think the storms of 2017, as well as the storms that we're seeing in this incredibly busy hurricane season this year, the Laura and Sally just hitting the Gulf Coast, illustrate this point that they're wetter and more intense. Ecosystems will change in response to climate patterns, and what we as humans choose to do with our land use practices, we have an opportunity either to mitigate or exacerbate the threats to our natural resources that are associated with climate change. And that's really an important point for us to remember is that we do have a strong role here. And if we take the steps, we can reduce those impacts. But if we don't, we're really going to be challenged moving forward. Next slide. So as we think ahead for the U.S. Virgin Islands, we also need to be aware of what else is happening, both nationally and globally. We are witnessing apocalyptic fires on the western states as we speak. And this resembles a lot of the fires that devastated many parts of Australia last year. We've had one of the, as I mentioned earlier, one of the busiest hurricane seasons in memory. We're also at the front end of a global trend of increased natural disasters and the beginning of a massive shift in populations from high-risk areas. And I mean, we refer to these folks as climate refugees, and whether it's the Louisiana coast and the islands there, or the Outer Banks in North Carolina, or the Alaskan coastal communities that are literally falling into the ocean because of the melting permafrost. All of these are just trends that are again, happening globally. So what does that mean at the national level? Our national capacity to support post-disaster recovery through agencies like FEMA is going to be reduced. They're simply overwhelmed by the cost and the frequency of these disasters. And what that means for us is that we and other cities and states should really not expect to see the kind of response like we saw after Irma Maria or Hurricane Sandy for the folks in Region 2 from New Jersey and New York. And I think the reality is that we have an opportunity here in the territory with the funding that we still are using for our recovery to make, more deliberate, more pragmatic considerations about how we redevelop with those funds our built environment, our communities, how we increase the quality of life. All of those things, we have the resources now. We have a real opportunity to do a good job recognizing the limitations that things like COVID and their impact on our economy and the federal, the federal economy, or excuse me, the national economy. All of these play into what we come up with in this hazard mitigation plan will need to be pragmatic, feasible. I think feasible is a real important word for us thinking about the strategies that we want to recommend and put forward. And I think, all of us on this team and our colleagues at VITEMA, I think, embrace this reality that we're going to have to do a lot with very little in the future. So let's do the best we can with what we have right now. So I think I'll stop there and turn it over to Jeff, who I think will be is going to start the question and answer session. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kim and Greg and Christine for a great presentation. There are a few questions that came in, and so I'll summarize them and direct them to the presenters, and then I'll pass it over to Pamela for closing. One question that came in was related to sea level rise. And I understand the question to be related to the rate of sea level rise today versus what it was in the 70s. Is it higher, the rate today, than it was in the 70s? I'm assuming so, but I just wanted to pose that question to the presenters.
Is it harder today than in the 70s, is the question?
The rate of sea level rise.
Is it greater? Yes. So the rate of sea level rise, the rate at which sea level is rising is increasing. That is correct. Yes. And so
Okay.
we're gonna see a more rapid acceleration moving forward. And the reason is because the rate at which the glaciers are melting is accelerating. And it's actually now at a stage where most climate scientists are saying that what they're observing now in terms of what's happening in the Arctics is what they were expecting to see, in a few decades. So things are changing and changing faster than we anticipated. And that means that the rate at which sea level is going to increase is going to be almost not exponential, but very, very curved.
Okay, great. Another general question, and it's related to one that was also presented in the chat, is can you all speak a little bit about the potential impacts of climate change on our economy and tourism? And is mitigation more about a global GHG issue, or is it more of a local adaptation issue in regards to beaches?
So I will let my colleagues chime in, but I will start by the second one, and then I think the first question is I think I would like everyone, all the panelists, to answer. So mitigation really refers to reduction in greenhouse gas emission, and the VI can do a lot, potentially with looking at what we emit, WAPA. For electricity production and what we emit, when we drive, because we are driving. There is no walking, very little walking, and almost no bicycling in the territory, or very little. So we can do, but in all honesty, what we will do will not make a whole dent because of much larger countries like the continental US, India, or Europe are doing. But we can do our part. But what we can do is adaptation, started to sort of adapt to the impact of climate change. And I mentioned some ideas, towards the end in terms of ways that we can start to adapt. In terms of the impact on the economy, from my point of view, the impact on the economy can be quite important. It's hard to quantify, and I think we can look at it as a part of a separate effort, maybe after we are done with the HMP. But this will have an impact on our beaches. And if we don't do something about either, making sure that beaches are wide enough, meaning, looking at how far we build from the beach so that the beach can continue to sort of expand a little bit, or maybe, nourishing some beaches, there will be some problem, especially in, very important places like Sandy Point, like Megan's Bay, and all of the beaches on the North Shore of St. John. Our change in climate and the increasing impact of drought will have impact on people's pocketbook, because we're going to have to buy water. So that might have an impact on our economic dynamicism, because we won't be able to spend money on other things. But there might be some issues with food. And so a dialogue is already happening, as Christina mentioned, but we probably want to put even more pressure on that dialogue to really think about what needs to be done for farmers to change, to adapt to a drying climate, but also a climate where the type of species that thrive might be different from what we had in the past. I'll stop there and see if Kim, Pamela, or Christina have any answers to that question.
I think from a economic impact perspective, there's just, two comments I'd like to make. One of which is, healthcare is expensive, and with the health impacts of climate change, if you don't have insurance, it's either going to drive up the cost for the territory and the government itself that's going to have to cover that, or it's going to drive up the cost for the end user, which is the person that has the insurance, the co-pays, the out-of-pocket. And so there is a real cost with that. Remember, if you have to have dialysis and you're a kidney patient, that requires water. So if we don't have water, we can't eat, we can't drink, we can't survive. The other thing that I would say on the agriculture side, and just to give a plug to the School of Agriculture, that's one of the things that in AES, Dr. Zimmerman works on pitaya and sweet potatoes and jicama. They're working on production of specialty crops that are use a lesser amount of water, and we're working on hydroponics and aquaponics and other systems that the School of Agriculture will promote in our community, so that we as a territory are more sustainable overall. And for those of you that have home gardens or micro gardens, It's important that you try to nourish yourself to the best of your ability because that has cost saving components for your pocketbook as well as health benefits. Dr. Waddell?
You're on mute, Kim. You're muted, Kim.
Yep. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. No, I was saying that I think Greg and Christina touched upon a lot of the points I was thinking of. I think with agriculture, I'm actually just getting started. I've done a few interviews with farmers and folks at AES and CES, and it's clear that one of the needs for our farming community to mitigate some of these challenges is better access to water. And so I think a community-wide collaboration, farmers, the government, and the neighborhoods need to work together to secure water resources and maintain them. I think that's one of the other challenges. A lot of our infrastructure in the territory is fragile because of the maintenance challenge, and it's wherever you are in the tropics. It's the harsh sun, the salt air, et cetera, et cetera. Doesn't matter what you have, it's going to degrade quickly in this environment. But we have a unique opportunity to try and improve the maintenance of our infrastructure because it's expensive, because we're at the end of the supply chain and bidding things here costs more, blah, blah, blah. So the other piece of that, though, is education. I think we are here at UVI extremely excited with the new School of Agriculture. And I think the adoption of more drought-resistant crop varieties, same with the animals. If we can, develop varieties of different things that can handle the heat, can handle the drought, or even disease resistance, which is the other, cofactor with increased temperatures. And then finally, I think the infrastructure, and this is important for tourism, this is important for agriculture, the quality of our roads are critical infrastructure that move products around. A lot of the farming areas are in remote areas, and one of the challenges they face is just, for example, out in Bordeaux on the west end of St. Thomas, is the poor road conditions. And so there's things that we can do together, there's things that will need federal or territorial help, and there's things that we can do as individuals that will mitigate this. Tourism is a challenge. I mean, COVID is really illustrating our vulnerability because of our reliance on cruise ships. And that sector, I mean, we hope it comes back, but I think it'll take many years for it to come back. And that's a major revenue stream for the territory. So we have to think creatively about our tourism product, adapt to some of the climate issues, recognizing that the importance, for example, of having shade trees near or on our beaches, for example, which may help hold the sand and whatever, but also protect both locals and tourists from extreme heat and things like that. I mean, there's small and large things that we can do because ultimately we're competing with a lot of parts of the world for our tourism product. And so we have to create a product that's unique and enjoyable and meets those expectations of the folks that fly in here or come in by boat. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, okay, thank you. There's a couple questions that relate to education and awareness about climate change. You touched on that, Kim, briefly, but the question specifically is related to what is being done to broaden education and awareness among youth. And then there's a second tier of question that is what is being done to build capacity in vulnerable communities in the territory. So 2 education questions, and then I'll come back to Christina with some drought specific questions, but I'll ask to keep the answers brief as the questions are coming in now, and we want to try to facilitate answers to all.
All right, well, on the education front, that's my other hat. The EPSCoR program has an element called workforce development, and we're working on introducing environmental topics and subjects and opportunities for our K-12 education system. So that's a big push. Several $1 million are going into that through our EPSCoR program. The university has adult education programs, and then Greg, myself, and a few other faculty are developing interdisciplinary courses where we show how to apply the science to the questions that are coming up, like how do we mitigate climate change and how do we do this and that? Real practical approaches to, through education. So it's much more experiential learning that we're promoting, and not just sort of the traditional textbook silo topics. The reality is most of our environmental challenges are interdisciplinary in nature. So I think there's a lot underway, and by all means, reach out to me. I'll be happy to expand on this.
Okay, there's a few questions that are specific to drought. Questions are, what is the role of the drought reporter in understanding drought impact studies? Another participant asks, how can community members, who do community members contact to participate in rainfall data? So I guess talking a little bit more about the drought monitor and reporting and those studies, and then also data collection.
Okay, so yes, you can become a drought reporter. We just need to get you a rain gauge that is appropriate and eligible. We have a grant that's funded to do that. We actually have drought reporters that are in fact youth. This summer we had junior interns. One was a 5th grader and one was an 8th grader. We also have an individual who's been documenting drought related or precipitation data in the territory for over 37 years. He's a retired employee of DPNR and National Park. So the spectrum is pretty wide in terms of the community stakeholder that can participate. We also have farmers, agency heads, a senator or former senator. So anyone that's interested and involved in that, you can get a hold of me through Dr. Waddell. As far as whether or not we would accept data, it depends on the way that it's submitted. If it's hand calculated, which a lot of people will have like a folder. We actually found a folder with 150 years worth of data, and it took us about 6 months to digitize it. So it depends on which format it's in. I have students that can assist with that. We did find at the museum in Frenchtown, ironically, the harbor master's weather book, and it was a handwritten book that was passed from harbor master to harbor master starting from the year before we were purchased from the Danes. So and that we literally took a lot of time to photograph, archive, and then clean the data. So some of it takes a lot of time, and it would depend on how that comes in. And then I just wanted to make one comment with regard to youth education. The University of the Virgin Islands in CMES has a water quality and environmental program. They have the Youth Ocean Explorers program in the summer. Cooperative Extension has Ag Discovery, and we also have STEM education in the schools. We have about $400,000 in funding to do rocketry, and part of that is to show the kids how to make rockets and become environmentally aware as well as interested in drought. We have a component where we've integrated weather balloons, and in the rockets we're going to put native seeds and we're going to blow them up and try to see if we can reseed part of the territory. So the University of the Virgin Islands is doing some amazing and fun activities in education, and we want all of our stakeholders to feel free and take part in any part of drought or drought monitoring and participate in mitigation tools. And if they have ideas, bring them to us. I mean, it takes a village. We're the village.
Okay, great. I guess there's two general categories of issues. I didn't want to gloss over beach protection came up once again, but questions were raised both in the Q&A and the chat about are we looking at what other Caribbean islands are doing in relation to climate change, sea level rise, and are we looking at the adaptation strategies that have been implemented throughout the region, as there are some good case samples? So that's a question that's being raised, and I'm assuming that there's some good samples of beach protection that have been found throughout the region. So I'll raise that, and then I'll close with one more comment before I pass it over to Pamela for closing remarks. So again, Caribbean Islands adaptation.
Yeah, no, I think and I saw from the chat room that Dr. Leonard Nurse from Barbados was raising this question about the successful actions in the region. And by all means, we continue to look at our colleagues and experts and experiences across the region. We are all small island developing states, and we share far too many of these natural disasters and hazards. And so it would be foolish not to look at what people are doing. And we have a hazard mitigation workshop that we host. Our next one is actually November 5th and 6th, and we look for emails and updates on that shortly. But in our previous meetings, we've hosted folks from different islands for the specific region to draw upon the expertise across the Caribbean. So I think that's absolutely essential. We don't need to reinvent the wheel here in the Virgin Islands.
And if I may, Christina wants to answer quickly. So Christina, just a few seconds, if you want to address the question with the farmer.
Yes. Three things just very briefly for the farmer that asked the question. There is the Office of the Interior is working on a drought mitigation task force. And so they are taking into consideration water and the movement of water in areas such as Bordeaux. So that's ongoing, and that is something that the university, the territory, elected officials, and our federal partners are working on. And Greg, Dr. Gunnell is a part of that team, so we can update you as that develops. And then also the University of the Virgin Islands Cooperative Extension with the Department of Agriculture, one of our main partners. We just completed with the University of Florida a research project. It's a survey on irrigation in the territory. It's 15 states, and the VI and Puerto Rico were included in that. And the hope of that is to study what the water usage is and develop conservation plans so that we can better utilize our water and share that information with Dr. Gunnell. And then the last thing is that as far as St. Croix, they have access to water and water trucks, whereas on St. Thomas, we don't have that access. So there is a little bit of a difference in terms of the impact for the agricultural community. And I know that Commissioner Nelson and the legislature are working on addressing some of these issues, but that may be something that a small stakeholder meeting could take place to maybe give you information and you can get feedback on, so that those stakeholders can be included in the dialogue for hazard mitigation as well.
Okay, great. I want to be conscious of time. A question came in on Facebook about community engagement. Will there be an opportunity for engaging the community in the hazard mitigation or future inputs into the hazard mitigation plan? Yes, absolutely. We're doing so virtually now in the post-COVID world, and we're hoping that we can do so in person, but absolutely we're planning on engaging the public and providing conduits for inputs. I want to end the question and answering session now to be conscious of time and pass it over to Pamela Richards for closing remarks.
Sure, thank you, Jeff. And I want to thank our panelists and also ask them if there's any little bite that they would like to wrap up and cover before we finish the panel. Something, because we've got
Yeah,
good
just
questions.
one. There was a question about co-ops, farmer co-ops, and it was a great point that was mentioned that most of our farmers are modest income, small farmers, and a lot of the technology and resources they need just simply are not affordable. And so the co-ops provide an opportunity for farmers to, gather, collect, and share their resources, and especially buying expensive equipment. And there's a model among Black farmers and small farmers across the United States, but especially in the Southeast, that Dr. Lewis Peterson and the CES and others have been working towards, and I've actually been talking to him about how we might integrate some of those ideas into the mitigation plan. So it's a wonderful thing that we will definitely pursue.
Yes, so I would like to personally thank everyone for coming tonight. Very, very engaging conversation. Lots of good ideas in the chat, lots of great questions. I just want to clarify one thing, which is climate mitigation has to do with, controlling, greenhouse gas emission. But we're working on a hazard mitigation plan. So what we're doing is really sort of thinking about solution to minimize the impact of hazard. So I just wanted to sort of make that clarification about the word mitigation when it comes to hazard mitigation compared to climate mitigation. But I really want to thank everyone for coming tonight. Really, really enjoyed the questions. I hope you all found it very useful. There's more information that we could give, but we will provide that through the plan on our website and hopefully through future engagement. We will have another engagement that we're planning for October, where we'll be talking more about what can be done at a household level to start mitigating against the impact of hazard, from taking care of your roof to your structure to maybe other things that you can do to mitigate against the impact of hazard, in addition for the territory-wide. So stay plugged in for that. Look out for flyers coming, but we will have a great, hopefully, other session in October before our workshop in November. So thank you so much. It was very fun to participate.
Ms. Christina, any last words?
I think that the most important thing that I would like to leave you with is that climate change is happening. No matter what our opinions are, the United States is on fire. There's 6 hurricanes whipping out of South Africa. There's massive flooding, and food security is a very real issue. You add in drought, and we as a community, we are a rock in the middle of the sea, and we need to work collectively, collaboratively, and cohesively. And we need to bring the best and the brightest minds to the territory to do that. We need to rely on our federal partners. We need to rely on the university and the legislature to work collectively. We need to integrate ag in as many areas as possible. And we need to have an exchange of historical information as experts with the next generation of individuals that are going to have to tackle this subject matter. It's not going to go away. This is a problem we're leaving for our children, and we have to do it together. So Dr. Waddell and Dr. Gunnell, thank you so much for including cooperative extension and working to develop a plan to help all of us. God bless you guys.
Come.
All right, thank you. I want to thank everyone for being here. It was a pleasure to be with you here today. I do want to ask Michael, can we pull up one more time now that we've gone through about 60 minutes of climate change information so that we can see if people's opinions have changed about whether or not climate change is an important threat to the Virgin Islands? Can you repost that one?
Yes, one moment.
So While he's posting, I want to give a shout out to JP Oriel. He's our Virgin Islands Commissioner of the Department of Planning and Natural Resources. Thank you for joining us, along with the Honorable Stedman Hodge, member of the 33rd Legislature of the Virgin Islands, and Royce Freaky. I see a farmer from St. Thomas. So we have all levels of the community here. And we've noticed that we have a lot of people nationally and around the region, our sister island, the Spanish Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico. Now that you've had a chance to digest some of the things in the presentation, does your opinion change? How important is the threat of climate change to the Virgin Islands?
Good answer.
It's fixed.
Great
It's fixed.
panel. All right, I'd like to invite our audience to join me in thanking our panelists, Ms. Christina Shanis, Dr. Greg Guanel, and Dr. Kim Waddell, and all the assisting staff at the University of the Virgin Islands. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you,
Bye,
everybody.
everyone.